Hey, Year 9 historians, it's time to talk about Australians in the Great War. Yeah, this is an Australian history course, and so we look at what Australians did in the Great War. Look, they weren't the most important group of soldiers in the war, but we're from Australia, so we're learning about them. Okay, our learning goals today are: know why Australia joined World War One. Know where Australians fought in World War One. Be able to use historical thinking concepts. There's 6 of them, and you're going to have a go at writing about some of them. So, the response to the outbreak of war. Australia joined the war because it was part of the British Empire. It is literally as simple as that. We were the only country in World War One who didn't have conscription. Now remember, conscription means being forced to join the military. Australia didn't have that. So, go Australia! Why did men enlist? So why did enlist means to join the army? So why did Australian men decide to join the army? They weren't forced to. Be pretty weird to choose voluntarily to go to the other side of the world and possibly die and shoot people. Here are the reasons. For travel. Travel was very rare and very expensive back then, so most people would never get the opportunity to travel to Europe if it wasn't for World War One. There was a lot of unemployment at the time, and if you joined the army, then that meant that you were going to have work, and yeah, you get money. And for adventure. It was sold by the people recruiting that it was really exciting, and if you've ever hung around young men before, you know that they crave adventure. And they did believe in Britain's cause, so they did think that the British Empire should be protected, and if it was under threat in Europe, then they wanted to go and protect it. Yeah, this is back when Australia was still part of the British Empire, so their beliefs aligned much more than they do these days. Right, so this is how it was reported in one of the newspapers. Germany declares war. All Europe is in arms. Whoa, arms meaning guns. Not arms. Everyone's got arms. Okay, some people don't have arms. You know what I mean. And here is a wad of people going to enlist in the army. And here's some soldiers from World War One. Check them out. Choice. Great moustache there in the middle. That is a quality moustache, my friend. So where did Australians fight in World War One? Firstly, obviously they fought in Gallipoli. That's the most famous one, which is a peninsula sticking out from Turkey, or as it was then, the Ottoman Empire. So in 1915 there was a failed attempt to invade Turkey. Sad. Oh well. On the Western Front, remember the Western Front is the border between France and Germany, and Australians fought there. They were involved from 1916 to 1918, so they didn't get there right at the start of the war. They got there about halfway through the war. In the Middle East. So there were some battles in 1916 and in 1918 against Turks in Egypt and Palestine, and Australians fought there as well. And finally, the war at sea. So remember, there were a few naval battles. The Royal Australian Navy, that's what RAN stands for. Remember how we mentioned in the last lesson that Germany lost all of its colonies? And there's the one that Australia took off them. New Guinea, which I think is called Papua New Guinea now. It's those islands up off the northern coast of Australia. And that was captured by the Royal Australian Navy in 1914. And it pushed the Germans out of the Pacific completely. Right, so here's a map. Yeah, you can kind of see why the Allies won. Everything in green is people who were on the side of the Allies by the end of the war. In orange are the Central Powers, and in grey are neutral. So where Australians fought, we're talking about here. This is where they took out German New Guinea, in the Middle East here in Egypt, in Gallipoli, which is in there, and on the Western Front, which is along here. So all those things that are highlighted in red, that's where Australians fought. Let's have a look at some of the places they fought. So this is Gallipoli. Heaps of soldiers up on the beach there. Some beach. That's just a load of dirt, really, isn't it? The Western Front. So there's some soldiers in the trenches along the border of France and Germany. In Egypt, that is an awesome photo. The Great Pyramids at Giza. They must have brought a kangaroo with them, because obviously kangaroos aren't native to Egypt, so I feel like there's a bit of animal cruelty going on in that one. This is in Palestine, so this is in the Middle East. This is fighting against the Turks as well. And in German New Guinea, so this is the Royal Australian Navy, where they captured German New Guinea. Okay, our activity today is to do with history concepts. So on the right here, you see 6 important historical thinking concepts. Historical significance, which is how important something is in history. Continuity and change, that's whether things stay the same or change. Usually a little bit of both. Historical perspectives, which is how different people in history see things and how different they can be. The ethical dimension, how historical actors have been ethical or not. Cause and consequence, which is cause and effect, really. And evidence, so how do we know about the things that we know about in history. And your activity, I want you to pick 2 of those concepts and explain how you think using those concepts would help you to understand World War I better. So pick any 2 of those 6. I want you to write 2 or 3 sentences about each concept, explaining how thinking using that concept would help you to understand World War I better. So you might say, with evidence including blah blah blah, this would help me to understand World War I better because I would have yada yada yada. Alright then. Okay, our first video today is Australia and World War I. Take it away.
Pango Quick Studies, Australia and World War I. In the 19th century, Europe was made up of empires competing for status by building impressive armies and colonising the rest of the world. Amongst these empires, 2 main alliances were maintained. On one side, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Germany and Italy, and on the other, Britain, France and Russia. Since the alliances were more or less even in strength, for a while no country would risk conflict with another. It was a time of prosperity, but there was enough tension that a single event could trigger the beginning of a war. That event was the 1914 assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His assassination in Sarajevo by Yugoslav nationalists caused a diplomatic crisis, which led to Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia. Within weeks, thanks to the alliances formed a decade earlier, Europe was at full-scale war. The Great War saw the increase of military technology and tactics. For the first time ever, battles were fought in the air and under the sea. Many weapons of modern warfare were introduced at this time, from tanks to machine guns, and World War I quickly became one of the deadliest wars in history. On the other side of the world, Australia, as part of the British Empire, was obliged to get involved. Men rushed to enlist in the armed forces, including many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, as pro-war sentiment swept through the young country. By the end of 1914, 50,000 men had enlisted, driven by loyalty to Britain and a perception that war was glorious and exciting. The Anzac soldiers swiftly found this wasn't the case upon landing in Gallipoli, Turkey. On the 25th of April 1915, the Anzacs found themselves ashore at a narrow beach facing steep cliffs. A great deal of confusion upon landing allowed Turkish forces, who had the advantageous higher ground, to halt the poorly organised attack. More than 600 Australian soldiers were killed on that first day, and it has since become a national day of remembrance in Australia and New Zealand. Overall, Australia lost 65% of the troops it sent to the war, the highest of any Commonwealth nation. By 1915, Australian enthusiasm for the war effort plummeted and volunteering declined. Twice, the Australian people voted no in a referendum for a military conscription, arguing that for a small population, the country had done more than its fair share to support Britain in a war half a world away. Post-war, Australia's involvement in the Gallipoli campaign became the stuff of legend. Often referred to as the birth of the nation, it came to be a significant factor in the still emerging Australian identity. The Anzac qualities of courage, mateship and sacrifice have become highly valued in the Australian culture and continue to define what it means to have the Aussie spirit. The anniversary of the Anzacs landing on Gallipoli is today a solemn remembrance of Australians who have served and died in all wars, conflicts and peacekeeping operations.
Our second video today is from a little series called World War I Factions, and this one is about the Australian Army.
Faction: the Australian Army, the First World War. Australia's regular army was formed in 1901, with all males of combat age required to undertake military training regularly. When the First World War began, Australia immediately offered to supply Britain with 20,000 troops. While the regular army was organized for home defense, a new overseas force called the Australian Imperial Force, or the AIF, was created. The AIF left Australia on November 7, 1914, and was sent to Egypt to train with British weapons. Australian and New Zealand forces were formed together to make the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, or ANZAC for short. They were sent to Gallipoli under the command of General William Birdwood. By the time they had to evacuate in January 1916, 1/3 of the Anzac force had been killed. After Gallipoli, the infantry began to move to the Western Front, taking part in several major battles. The cavalry, meanwhile, were transferred to Palestine and played an important role in the Battle of Gaza. In 1918, as the German army launched its spring offensive, all of the AIF divisions in France were engaged in the attempt to stem the tide. In May 1918, General John Monash and the Australian Corps led important counteroffensives at Le Hamel. They would use the peaceful penetration strategy, which was a cross between trench raiding and patrolling. Australia contributed 322,000 soldiers in the First World War, with a high casualty rate of 210,000, of whom 60,000 Australians were killed. Watch our other videos to learn more.
Today's reflection activity, I want you to do a PMI, plus minus interesting, on the topic Australians in World War I. So thinking about the idea of Australian soldiers fighting in World War I, what was a good thing, what were the bad things, and what else was interesting. So draw a little diagram like that and chuck a couple of things underneath each heading. Yep. So, your homework. I want you to draw one piece of World War I military technology that you find impressive. There's some examples in that picture there, but you certainly don't need to use any of them. There were tanks, early planes, mustard gas, flamethrowers are another fun one. There's a whole heap of different guns there. So have a Google search of World War I military technology, look at some images, and then draw your own version of one of those pieces of military technology and label it with at least 5 annotations. Radical. Bonus homework, if you are so inclined, which I think you should be. Read chapter 8.5 from the Jacaranda textbook and check out this video. bit.ly/AnzacWords2020. That's all for today, folks. Remember, keep it real.